Greetings. It's good to have all those who are participating today in this discussion to be present here at this particular time. It gives me great honor to be able to share some of my vivid and up close and candid memories as far as my training on a personal basis with the late great Grandmaster Angel Cabales. Feel free to send in any kind of inquiries or questions regarding his particular method of martial arts. And also keep in mind that this is a healthy discussion regarding the infrastructure and some of the fundamental and advanced masterful aspects of the Cabales Serrada system of Escrima. So we're going to keep it combative and we're going to talk some real talk. At any rate, just to give you a little background on me, I started training in the field of martial arts at the age of 15 years old. My introduction to the martial arts was somewhat traumatic. As a youngster, I used to pass by a particular martial arts school on my way home from school. And to make a long story short, the name of the school was Al Reyes's Kajukenbo. And I used to really admire the artistry of the artwork on the storefront window of the school. And being into art myself, and symmetry was a really important thing to me. I could see that whoever sketched or painted this particular portrait on the storefront window was also artistic in other ways as well. It turned out to be Professor, the late great Grand Professor Alehu Al Reyes, as they call him, Senior. And this was his school. I used to go by the school all the time, but I was always reluctant to go inside of the building. So one day, I guess I mustered up a certain amount of courage and walked into the building. And wow, it was like stepping into some type of historical ancient past. Everybody was basically in symmetry, as I mentioned a little earlier, only this time they were in symmetry physically. And I was able to sit down, observe for a while. And after about maybe 15 minutes of sitting there, Professor Al Reyes Sr. Motioned with his hands to come over and sit next to him. He was more further up where the dojo or the chief grandmaster would sit. So I walked around the mat area, went over, sat next to him, and he asked me a couple of questions like, "What are you doing in here? What's your interest?" And I told him what I just got finished explaining about the artwork on the window. And he said, "Well, you have a pretty meticulous eye." So he said, "You come back in here anytime you want to." And so that was my first experience and introduction into the field of somewhat martial arts. But, prior to that, like everybody else, Bruce Lee was around, Kato, and, we had our different icons and archetypes as far as who we followed in terms of, who inspired us in the world of martial arts. So similarities in what other great martial artists have also used as archetypes as well. My second official introduction into the art of combat was basically perpetrated upon me. There were other Kajukenbo constituents, rival Kajukenbo schools going on in the area at the time as well. But some of those particular individuals didn't always represent the most honorable aspects of Kajukenbo. So I guess, I started kind of picking up a lot of stuff at the Reyes school and just, libraries and anywhere I could find martial knowledge. That is essentially where I would, gather that information from. And so, actually self-experimentational type of stuff at first and really absorbing, as Bruce Lee would have said, what is useful and discarding what is useless. And so 16, I think right around there, I kind of started gaining a reputation for being a pretty good fighter, street fighter. So, and the way I gained that reputation is by way of sparring with some of the Kajukenbo aspirants that were pretty high-ranking instructors and senior instructors at that time. So, just make a long story short, or I pretty much won all the matches, and there were some that were pretty bloody, but I always can say that I came out pretty much on top all the time. So, without naming names, that gave me a strong sense of self-confidence at that point in time, because there were a lot of techniques that I was experimenting with, martial art wise, from different systems of martial arts that some looked pretty and fancy, but just weren't practical when you actually try to apply them in actual combative situations. I guess my next experience was with another Kajukenbo great. His name was Phil Cornyn, and Phil Cornyn was probably one of the late Professor Tony Ramos Sr.'s most fiercest and most ferocious fighters, if I could put it that way. He was a natural fighter. He was extremely strong physically, and he had a reputation already as a bouncer for having to have to deal with close quarter combative situations. So, but also he was a 5-time and maybe even more champion at the old CKC karate championships that used to be held in Richmond and Oakland, California. That were sponsored by the late great grand professor Bill Chen Sr., along with his partner at that time, Grand Professor Leo T. Fong. They were the two components that gave the Northern Cal major championship tournaments. And Phil Cornyn was one of the top rated fighters of his time. He was good on the street, but he was also expert within the arena of sport as well. Some of the fighters that he fought or also co-champions were the miraculous Benny the Jet Urquidez. That particular fight, I think, is on YouTube. You can see that. But yeah, it's interesting because they both are sort of more eclectic in the ring at that time. Although a lot of people think that the non-contact tournaments were non-contact, they were far from that. And so Phil Cornyn and both Benny the Jet Urquidez were two of the most top-rated fighters of their times. And so that was an interesting match. So check that out. So going back to Phil Cornyn, however, what I wanted to say was that it is by way of the late Phil Cornyn that I was able to really get even a more sense or stronger sense of self-confidence. And I had heard about his reputation. So, some people call him Crazy Phil. And don't go around that guy, because he did have a tendency to flip his personality if he didn't like you. So, but at any rate, one day, actually one morning, because I knew he did bouncing work, I had prepared some food for him and, packaged it up really, really good and placed it on his front porch. And I guess when he got in from doing his particular job as a bouncer at a local nightclub that he worked at, he would come in, early in the morning. So he found that food evidently. And so my master strategy was to basically go back a little later and knock on the door. And that's what I did. So once I got over there, I knocked on the door. And of course, the butterflies were flying. And he answered the door. And he looked out, like, kind of like, who are you? And I was like, oh, my name is such and such and such and such. And I'm the one who left the food on your front porch. And he looked at me and he said, oh, that's you? oh, come on in. So I came, I got through the front door. That was the first step alive. At that particular point, he mellowed out a little bit. And right at the entranceway, when you go through the front door, you could see all the immaculate trophies and awards that he had received from all the different fights and encounters that he had had in his personal experiences. And so he was automatically pointing things out like, oh, I took that trophy from Chuck Norris. I took that trophy from Benny. We fought. He got it. But hey, as far as I'm concerned, it was an even out fight. But I took this trophy from Luis Delgado and, some of the great fighters he had come up against. And what a lot of people might not know about the late Phil Cornyn is that he also was a personal student under the legendary Bruce Lee when Bruce Lee was basically teaching his school in Oakland, California. Phil Cornyn was one of the private students that was admitted or allowed to be able to train at the school. So that same day, he opened up his phone book and he showed me Bruce Lee's telephone number and his name. And of course, being a Bruce Lee fanatic myself, I automatically asked him, I said, you think that, one day you might be able to hook me up? And he's like, I don't know. Bruce Lee's pretty meticulous about who he picks as far as his students. So I left it at that. It was just a great honor to be in the presence of somebody like Phil Cornyn. So I'd like to give him kudos out on behalf of Kajukenbo. But also adding to that, I requested from the great Phil Cornyn to study under him. I didn't submit under too many people, but he was one of the ones that I didn't mind learning anything from because I knew his reputation. At any rate, we go out to a local park. He says, yes, I'll teach you. So I come back the next day and I think we're going to train at his house because, he had a pretty big backyard and everything. But he took me out to a local park. And I'm thinking all the way out that we're driving over there. Why is he taking me out, where cars are passing by? I guess he's going to beat me to death in front of the public eye. And so, at any rate, it didn't turn out like that. We squared off a little bit. He wanted to see what I, knew and, how he could help me and so forth. So he got some good punches and powerful kicks in, but I retaliated with a high roundhouse kick that I guess he didn't really see or catch, but it stunned him. And he stopped at that point. And he basically shut down the sparring session and said, we'll continue at a later date. So that was my experience with the immaculate Phil Cornyn. And again, it helped to boost my sense of confidence. The next or the third official experience was that, as you begin to gain a reputation, I guess, as a fighter, you start to get all kinds of challenges one way or the other. I know I've had my share, but there was a point in time where I was challenged by one of the local top Kajukenbo instructors of his time. And one of his sons used to drive around in an ice cream truck. And to make a long story shorter, he delivered the message on behalf of his father. And he said to me that his father challenged me to a death match. And I was like, are you kidding? A death match? He says he really wants a actual death match to the death? And he says, yeah, that's what he said. And he said at first he wanted me to do it. And I told him I refused to do anything like that. So I said, well, I looked at this particular professor, Kajukenbo professor's son, in the eyes. And I told him, I said, well, you go back and tell your father that I accept the challenge. And he looked at me as though, I had lost my mind or something like that. And it's possible that I probably had. I didn't think that way at the time. But at any rate, a date was set, and I went over to the professor's school. And basically, he called me up on the second floor where his office was. And he looked at me and he said, you sure you want to do this? And I said, that's why I'm here, sir. And so he put a piece of paper in front of me and said, sign this. And I said, what's that? And he said, oh, that's a liability form, or a form of release, that if, you should become critically hurt or killed, you're releasing me from all damages and so forth. So, and then he gave me a stern look. And so I took the pen and I signed it. Then he gave me a different type of look, like, so he told me to go downstairs and to basically stretch out, loosen up, and he'd be down, to complete his challenge of the death match toward me. And I said, okay. So I went downstairs, and one of the young ladies that was spectating in the school at the time, we actually were contemporaries in school, and she whispered over to me. She said, be careful, because they're going to all try to jump you. And I just kind of looked at her and I said, yeah, I'm kind of aware of that. So anyway, I thanked her for her pre-warning, and it just put me more in a combative frame of mind. So anyway, we get out there, and the chief instructor comes down, the professor, and he tells all his students, he says, today we're not going to be doing pinyons or katas. Today is fight day, and we have a challenger within our school today who has come here to basically challenge me to a death match. And I had to raise my hand at that point, and I said, excuse me, sir. I said, I did not challenge you to a death match. You challenged me to a death match. And so I just wanted to make that, clear to all those who are listening and watching. So he didn't say anything at that point. So anyway, he asked me to talk a little bit about my background and who I trained from and so forth. So after we got through all of that, I'm expecting to spar with him. But he told all of the students that before he can spar with me, he's got to get past some of my senior students. And so I didn't know that that was part of the arrangement. I thought that we were just going to go one-on-one right away. So anyway, that wasn't a problem. I agreed to it. So he squared me off with a very strong and powerful-looking young African-American man. And I knew him also. He was pretty well-known in the city. And first thing that happened was just a clash, but I think mine got to him first. And I spun around about 2 or 3 times like a spinning top. And I didn't see him. And so I thought, is this guy a ninja? Did he learn some type of invisibility skills or something? And I'm looking around for him and so forth. And then finally something said, look down. And I looked down, and this gentleman was laid out like a 2x4 that just fell apart. Yeah, he was knocked out. I KO'd him quick. And at that point, the professor, he looked at me, and I'm like, well, when do we spar? He looked at me even harder, and he said, get out of my school. You don't have any control. You don't have any self-control. You're too violent. And I'm thinking to myself, I said, sir, but you challenged me to a death match. So I didn't come here prepared to, sport fight or anything like that. I came here prepared to fight to the death. And so to make a even longer story shorter, I got kicked out of the school. I was happy about it. Who wants to fight a death match if you can avoid something like that? So, but what that did was it really convinced me that all of the pre-training, the absorption of knowledge, even, to the different schools I would visit and sort of mentally record all the things that I would see. The running, I would run every day. Sometimes I would take the short run, which is 3 miles, and then I would combine that with a 7 mile run, and I would run with weights, 5, 10 pound weights around my ankles, and do these things that somewhat Bruce Lee had recommended in his book called the Tao of Jeet Kune Do. So just a combination of all these things and putting it together, had convinced me that I was on the right path. And so I continued to develop my own methodology and approach to combat. From that point forward, I also knew that hands were very important. And so, we have immaculate kicks within the world of martial arts, but at the same time, many times we don't know how or understand how to use our hands more effectively. And so I turned to a very good recommended friend of mine today by the name of Jesse Lopez Sr. And he's a former boxing champion from Mexico City. He's been in the state of California, I'm sure, for many, many, many years, going as far back as the 60s, but today continues to coach boxing and to teach young people the basic fundamentals and the advanced fundamentals of boxing. But I turned to him in order to get a more profound understanding of how a boxer looks at combat in terms of their approach. And so he did a fantastic job with me. I was able to combine all that particular methodology from Mexico City. As he says, this is the Mexico City style, and to put it also and integrate it into what I had already accomplished and basically perfected within the field of combat. And so, we're talking now 45 years later, all those things have accumulated into a process of refinement. And what really refined all of that training was the late great Grandmaster Angel Cabales. And I want to turn to that now because to make a long story shorter, it was Angel who basically put the icing on the cake for my particular methodology of training. And I also wanted to basically familiarize myself with the martial arts system that was effective in today's urban streets. I mean, we learn a lot of things in long method as far as long swords, broadswords, and I was pretty proficient with all those type of various weapons. But to me, many of them were not practical, and so I had to essentially seek out some type of weapon art that could be applied in a simplistic but yet effective way in the streets. And so who had obtained this type of information. I'm speaking of Guru Dan Inosanto now, because he was actually the first FMA or Filipino martial arts aficionado that I had come in contact with officially in the world of Filipino stick knife fighting. And the way that happened was that in 1976, I relocated to the state of Ohio, Cleveland, Ohio, to be exact, and opened up a Kajukenbo kickboxing school in the city of Cleveland. And Cleveland has its own circle, so to speak, or inner circle of martial art instructors and schools who basically roll together and support each other's tournaments, etc. And coming out from the West Coast, especially Cali at that particular time, they weren't too fond of California people as far as, our, I guess our reputation is one that precedes itself. They think that we are very wealthy for one thing. But at any rate, I guess I got tested in one of the first tournaments that I participated in at Cleveland State College, University. But at any rate, yeah, it was supposed to be non-contact in this particular tournament, but it turned out to be more full contact. And so I was very familiar with that way of fighting already. And so I was able to adapt, improvise, and overcome all that stuff in the end. And we gained a pretty solid reputation, but we still weren't accepted within the inner circle of martial artists within the community. And so we decided to just go strictly independent. But by doing that, we didn't get any support for our exhibitions, tournaments, anything that we promoted. Certain people would support, like to get kudos out to Grandmaster Greg Mayo of Northern Wind. He's always been a star supporter in everything that I've have laid out in Cleveland, Ohio, and even to this day, he still supports. So, but other than him and a few other constituents, mainly my students, we didn't have very much support. So, going back to Dan Inosanto, I had gotten to a point to where it was either shut this school down, or we're going to have to do something drastic in order to gain more popularity for what we were doing. And so, I was in the school one day, and it dawned upon me that, why don't I just wing something? Why don't I give Dan Inosanto a telephone call? I'm sure he's not going to answer. I'm sure it's going to be very difficult to talk with him because he's so popular, and everybody knows that he was one of the primary students of the legendary Bruce Lee. So I kind of gave up on the idea, but at the same time, I meditated upon it and breathed it because I'm very strong into breathing. And all of a sudden, something said, just call him. I called him up, and guess who answered the telephone? It was Dan Inosanto himself. And I explained to him what I just finished explaining regarding the clannishness and how the martial art community operates here in Cleveland. And he listened intently, and he said, well, you know what? We're expanding Kali and Jeet Kune Do around the country as well as the world. And we'd be more than happy to come in and support your campaign. So you set it up and make the arrangements, and we'll be there. And so that was in 1980. And we brought Dan Inosanto along with his partner at the time, the late great Grandmaster Richard S. Bustillo. And essentially, that is the way that the FMA arts entered into the state of Ohio for the first time. And that was also my first official introduction to Filipino martial arts as well. And so essentially from that point forward, because of that particular promotion, and because Guru Inosanto vehemently spoke about his great influences in the world of Filipino martial arts, such as the immaculate Leo Heron, great Grandmaster Leo Heron. He spoke about other people like great Grandmaster Johnny LaCosta, and he especially spoke about another gentleman by the name of the late great Grandmaster Angel Cabales. And it appeared that Angel Cabales had the most significant influence on him because it was most of his art that he was utilizing in 1980 at the Ohio seminar. So all of that was filmed, and of course, going back to the Kajukenbo days, before cameras, I was using my mind to record all these things. But in this case, we filmed everything that took place at the particular workshop. So heading back into the West Coast, probably around 2.5 to 3 years later, I gave another workshop, this time featuring the late, great Grandmaster Maha Guru Ted Lucaylucay. He was the headliner, and we featured him in the Solano County area of California and Northern Cal. And essentially, Dan Inosanto once again came on board that particular promotion. And it was the first time that Filipino martial arts had ever been introduced into the Solano County area. And so it was a major event because the mayor of that city at the time came out to support. Like to give kudos out to the mayor for supporting. And make a longer story even shorter again, it was an immaculate event that officially introduced Filipino martial arts. Many of the Kajukenbo people came out to support the event. And miraculously and unexpectedly, the very professor that I mentioned about who challenged me to a death match actually came out and supported the event as well. And it turned out that he was the senior Kajukenbo instructor for Richard S. Bustillo, as well as Dan Inosanto. So he was their Manon in the Hawaiian art of Kajukenbo. And so he actually came out and supported. And on top of it, he actually apologized to me as well for, the inconvenience of, what he considered to be his ego being overly inflated at the time. And so he told me he really respected the fact that I brought Dan Inosanto, Ted Lucaylucay, and his wife at the time, Tanya Lucaylucay, to this particular event. And so everything came back full circle on that. So again, the legendary Angel Cabales was vehemently talked about. And at that particular seminar, Ted Lucaylucay actually sanctioned my first Filipino Martial Arts Association and gave us the green light to continue on our journey in the FMA world. And he also was the nucleus and the official stamp for my first Filipino Kali Association. And so kudos out to the late Maha Guru Ted Lucaylucay. Additionally, I'd like to say that Ted Lucaylucay also recommended that I go directly to Angel Cabales and basically cut out the middleman and just go straight to the Grandmaster. And so in 1984, that's exactly what happened. I gave my third workshop in the San Francisco area featuring the legendary Dan Inosanto this time again. And at the time, I think Danny was in Chicago. Something happened with his health, and he wasn't able to make that seminar. And so basically, in the end, we were able to secure three great grandmasters who have passed to take the place of Dan Inosanto at that particular seminar. One of those gentlemen was the late great Grandmaster Gilbert Tino of the ubiquitous system of Escrima, along with his partner, great Grand Professor John Eliab. Both of those Grandmasters were members and high-ranking officers in the organization or association known as Jiu-Jitsu America, which I think the late great Grand Professor Wally J. At one point headed. But they were also special guests at this function, demonstrated and talked about the art. And along with them, the legendary late great Grandmaster Angel Cabales, who became the principal highlight, attended the event. And all I can say is that from that point forward, the great cabal of Cabales, Serrada, Escrima was rolling. And also, I was also given a special invitation directly from the great Grandmaster to learn his particular system of Escrima directly from him. And that is my evolutionary beginning in the field of the Cabales Serrada system of Escrima. So at this point, I'm going to leave off and see if I can now master this chat discussion. This is my first time doing a chat. And so if you don't hear something or you think something technical is going on, you can school me. And then maybe in the next chat, we can, flow, ebb and flow a little bit more flowmatically. So at any rate, I'm going to just answer a few people and say hello to one of the brothers that has supported this channel for a long time. And we certainly appreciate all the support that we can get on this particular channel, because what we try to cover are the most authentic and the most dedicated martial arts systems and instructors around the world. And many of those instructors aren't even heard of unless some people like myself or yourself bring them out into the open. That's what happened in the late great Grandmaster Angel Cabales' case. And make a long story short, he wasn't the greatest speaker in the world, but when he demonstrated his particular form of Escrima, that did all the talking for him. My first time actually experiencing watching the great Grandmaster in action was just, one of total awe. I just never seen anybody move a weapon that fast and that precise with that type of precision and power, at that rate of speed, and not hurt in some way the other participant. And Angel was flawless in terms of his art. He moved like a feather, and he shifted so incognitely that, you'd have to really, really pay close attention in order to pick up some of the intricacies of what he was doing. And so, watching Angel did all the talking. So at any rate, another thing about the late great Grandmaster Angel Cabales was that one of my assistant instructors at the time, Jeff Stickman Finder, had gone down to Stockton, California to basically, train under the Grandmaster directly. And so we were sitting at this particular point at the Grandmaster's table, and it was time to go get something to eat. And so as we walked out the door through the entranceway, some big chimes fell off the wall, or from under the roof where the doorway comes out and goes in. And Angel moved so fast. I mean, he snatched these things so quick that there's no way that he expected these things to fall on his head in the way that he did. But to make a long story shorter, again, his reflexes were just that keen, and that's how Angel, basically used his art even on a regular day-to-day basis. I mean, and then he explained to Jeff Finder and myself a little later that his drills may seem simplistic to those who are observing the drills, but the thing is that the more you do the drills, the more your sensitivity to feel and energy and things coming into your radius will become. And so you find this out over a period of time. The more you do these basic fundamental tactics, the more you begin to see the subtle intricacies within those tactics. So in my personal experience with the late great Grandmaster Angel Cabales, when I first participated in Stockton, California, my first lesson with him, I had a pretty good sound basis of the art of Kali as taught and introduced and shared by the late Richard S. Bustillo and also Guru Dan Inosanto. So, One beautiful thing about Filipino martial arts is that it's not based upon necessarily a time process as far as your elevation process in the art. It's just based upon how fast and how sharp you were able to pick up on basic angles and drills and so forth. So, like what might be called a block in one system in Cabales Serrada Escrima, I would have to say that they don't necessarily block anything. Uh, like the art or similar to the arts of Wing Chun and Jeet Kune Do, there's a lot of intercepting type of movements that are manipulated within movements, if I could say it like that. And it's a very very elusive art as well. In other words, going back to that first lesson, it was a dagger lesson. Uh, Grandmaster Cabales asked me to, show me what I would do in terms of the Kali system of martial arts if he stabbed me with a number 5. And as he was saying that, I was already stabbed. So basically, he explained to me that it's not that the Kali wasn't effective enough to be able to stop the stab. It's just that he said that my system is very, very tight. And that's why we call it Serrada or Serrado Escrima. Serrada meaning to close or close, and Escrima meaning skirmish, the Portuguese for skirmish. So basically, close encounter or quick skirmish. And so he showed me the same technique, but this time I was to deliver the knife stab at him. And so I tried to come out of nowhere by hiding the knife behind my thigh area, my right thigh area. That way he wouldn't know when I was going to try to, implement stabbing him with the number 5 or the solar plex strike or stab. And so I came out of basically nowhere, but before I could recognize what was actually going on, I was already on the floor. and that amazed me. And so that was my first lesson with him. I asked him to explain the intricacies of why one tactic was not effective versus what he had done in terms of his counterattack against me. And so we essentially began to train for like hours that day. And I don't think I got back into the city I lived in at the time until maybe about 4 o'clock that next morning. And so going back to this straight stab strike, in the Kabbalah Serrada system of Escrima, they are non-telegraphic. If you see a strike come way back here from a Serrada door, Escrima door, that is because maybe he wants you to think that he is going to swing at you wide, and maybe he'll change up on you at that particular time. Or it could be that there's this natural tendency to pull the weapon back too far. Well, this is what the late great Grandmaster Angel Cabales was teaching me, was that to do this and not know why you're doing it, you're wasting time, motion, and movement. And plus you're so wide that, according to the late great Grandmaster, and he's demonstrated it upon me many a times, I can smack you at least 8 to 9 times before you can pull that hand even more forward. And the short stick, which is measured, which is symbolic of the Serrada system of Escrima, the short stick that the late great Grandmaster used was measured from armpit down to the palm, or a little past the palm. And so basically he said that this was more practical. It was akin to like you wouldn't buy a shoe that was too big for you or too small for you. And if you did, you wouldn't feel comfortable wearing them. So the stick, as far as how it's measured from the armpit down to the little past the palm, is basically the size of the individual that's using the stick. And so it fits you. And I was very impressed with that, because that's practical. It's like wearing a shirt. You're not going to wear something too big, too big for you, and so forth. So, but at any rate, he explained his knife movement and how he allowed an opponent to actually commit the strike. In other words, to me, I had always been taught to try to step away from a strike or try to avoid it at all costs. But in the Cabales Serrada system of Escrima, according to Angel, you actually allow the opponent to take the target because, this is the machismo or the type of training that Angel had received from his teacher, Felicissimo Gison, back in the Philippines. In other words, it's all about the heart. After you've honed the art to a certain degree, now the only thing that's going to make it effective is if that art can save or help you in times of those unexpected situations. So everything is already at the opponent or the person being attacked is already essentially being attacked. So you're not waiting for the attacker. So essentially, he explained that the system is a counter system. And so it is based upon an attack that's already been, heaped upon you. And so you're able to move quicker. You have to learn to move with minimum amount of motion so that you can actually be where you need to be quicker rather than to try to make too wide motions to try to, take your assailant out or assailants. So I was very impressed with that. And that gave me a keener understanding that all these movements in other systems of martial arts can be condensed in that way as well. So essentially, that is the first, experience with the late great Grandmaster Angel Cabales. And he must be in the room right now because the stick is moving. And that's another story Angel told me. He said, "You ever see the stick dance around?" And I said, "No, can a stick dance?" And he said, "Yeah, watch me." So basically, Angel was a comedian when he wanted to be. And, I love that about him too, because he had a very down to earth, earth angel, if I could use that terminology, type of personality. And we actually became family in the sense that my kids, my children, grew up with some of his children. And to make a long story short, we've celebrated birthday parties with the late great Grandmaster. And I got to know him in other ways. Because to me, in order to understand a particular system of martial arts, you need to actually sit down with that person or persons and pick into their brain and see where they're actually coming from, because everybody has a different approach in psychology that makes them distinctive in how they do things. And one thing people will agree with regarding the late great Grandmaster Angel Cabales, especially those people who have trained directly under the Grandmaster, is that Angel never lied about his combative experiences. He always told you like it was. And when those stories come out about his death matches that he participated in, or Hawaiian Togos and so forth, Angel, when I asked him about those same stories, he confirmed them. But at the same time, he also told me there was nothing pretty about it. There was nothing, humble about it. There was nothing egotistical about it. Everything about doing things along those lines. He said there's always going to be a karmic reaction, and things are going to come back to where you'll have to deal with your choices. And so, I respected the fact that, he always told me like it was. And another thing I totally regard about Angel is that he was not race conscious at all. He has African American grandkids, probably by now great grandkids. But at the same time, he was above and beyond a lot of the petty clannishness that you'll find amongst many Filipinos. I'm not saying all, but there are those who basically won't let you inside their cliques and so forth. Whereas Angel, he opened up the door to everything that he knew. He didn't hold anything back, and he told you that straight up. And I asked him that one time, well, why is that, Angel? I said, because, to a lot of business minded people, that's just not a smart way to go about, making money in the field of martial arts. And he told me, he says, well, the thing is that I'm more concerned about my students' self-defense, that if they get in a situation, they know everything that I taught them instead of little pieces, because maybe today they walk outside the door and then they get attacked right away. So I have to teach them what they need to know right now. And that's my best impression of Angel and how he put it to me that day. And so to, quote Angel, learning Filipino martial arts of any style, and especially his, has nothing to do with race, culture, or creed, but it has everything to do with determination and heart and presence of mind. And essentially, that's what brought us even closer together. So at this particular point, I'm going to end the live stream. I have another class to teach. I was busy all day today, and we're going to try this again. Like I said, this is my first live stream. Brother Jay Daniels, I'm so happy that you, JJ Daniels, I'm glad that you tuned in. I follow you as well. We got Master D out there also tuned in. It's really good to see both of you guys. But listen, we will continue a part two of this discussion. And when we come back with the part two version of this discussion, I will have mastered a little bit more about answering questions and how to operate the system a little bit more better. I want to thank you for tuning in and listening to some of the candid personal experiences that I had with the late great Grandmaster Angel Cabales. There are so many of them that we'll have an ongoing series, I guarantee you. So, mabuhay ang Cabales Escrima, and salamat po. So in the stream. All right. You ended it. Not yet. Are you sure you want to end your stream? Yes.